One of my favorite things about the costuming in the movie Nosferatu is the way that you can see Ellen's struggles through them. So, in case you don't know or haven't seen the movie, 2024's Nosferatu, directed by Robert Eggers, who coincidentally also directed The Witch, a movie that terrified me, the one with Anya Taylor-Joy. Anyways, Nosferatu is a retelling of the 1922 original silent movie, which was based on the novel Dracula by Bram Stoker. The 2024 movie is nominated for Best Costume Design in this year's Academy Awards. It tells the story of Ellen, who, by all intents and purposes, is a seemingly normal, and I put that in quotation, woman in 1838 Germany. We first meet her and her husband, Thomas Hutter, as they struggle to earn a good living that will match the sort of standing of the class that they want to be in society. Thomas is frustrated because their close family friends, his wealthy friend Friedrich Harding and his wife Anna and their two young daughters Clara and Louise, are much wealthier than they are. And I'm not saying that this was all of Thomas's motivation for for making the choices that he makes in the movie, but I would say that it was almost like a trigger for him, to see his friends like living like this lavish life, and there was like an itch for him to provide for his wife in the same way. Now, we come to learn that Ellen has a weird thing going on with her, where when she was younger, she prayed that something will ease her loneliness. Something. So the prayer that she says is, "Come to me, a guardian angel, a spirit of comfort, spirit of any celestial sphere, anything, hear my call." Now, through a series of unfortunate events, that was the moment that she swore herself to Count Orlok, or Nosferatu. Count Orlok is the human name of this monster, if you will. Nosferatu is the name of the monster. So she swore herself to Nosferatu to be with him eternally, and since then he has stalked her telepathically and in her dreams. And at the start of the film, an opportunity comes up for Thomas to go abroad and sell an old count, spoiler alert, that was Count Orlok, some real estate. And that's really where the movie starts, because Count Orlok takes the opportunity to get closer to Ellen. Now, I will talk about the costuming and storytelling of this movie, but first, hello! Welcome back to A Love Letter To. I'm your host, Danielle Olavario. I'm so sorry there wasn't an episode last week. Life happens, you know how it goes, but I'm so excited for this episode. It's the second installation of a mini-series in the pod where I talk about some of the nominees for Best Costume Design in the Oscars from now until the Oscar ceremony airs on March 3rd. I loved this movie, Nosferatu. I really did. I saw it with my cousin in the cinema, and I think I was surprised as well because I'm not usually a horror movie buff. In fact, I hate it. But it's the first serious horror movie that I really enjoyed and didn't watch the whole time with my eyes behind my fingers. You know what I mean? And I loved it because to me, it's not just horror for horror's sake. It's a horror movie that reflects the things that we deal with in the real world. It's full of metaphors and allegories, and I'm going to talk about some of them obviously in this episode. Obviously going to contain spoilers. I'm going to talk about a lot of spoilers. So if you haven't seen the movie, I really encourage you to watch it if that's your thing. But yeah, let's get into it. So the costumes for this movie were designed by Linda Muir, who is a longtime collaborator of the director Robert Eggers. And for the interest of time, I'm just going to be focusing on Ellen's costumes. And I'm not even going to go into like the historical accuracies of her clothes. I believe that other people have done an incredible job doing just that, like Karolina Zebrowska here on YouTube. I love her. If you don't know her, her thing is historically accurate clothing. She talks about this movie and other movies, and she's really, really funny as well. And so I really recommend you watch her video on Nosferatu. But what I would say is that obviously this story is set in 1838 Germany. So the clothing and style in the movie is very much of that era. We're talking massive, like sort of frilly sleeves, large skirts with pleats and trimmings and little details, very, very long garments. I think Anna, who is the rich friend's wife, portrayed by Emma Corrin, wears a lot of the very much current styles du jour, whereas Ellen, because of her financial standing, looks a little bit more busted, for lack of a better word. But those are just general readings. As I said, if you're interested in the historical side of things, there are other content creators that really get into the nitty-gritty of historical costuming. I'm just going to talk about the costume from a stylistic and narrative point of view. So let's go. I think it's important to note that Ellen comes from a moneyed background, but when she met Thomas and marries him, she embraces a much simpler life. They're not peasants by any means, but they're not as rich as the Hardings. They don't have, servants or garments made of the finest materials. Ellen is completely okay with that, but it was Thomas that wanted to give Ellen these luxuries. And when Thomas was making the decision to leave for the Count's place, Ellen begs him not to. And, that was like sort of the when things go wrong for Ellen and Thomas in the movie is when Thomas didn't listen to his wife. And when they finally had a serious conversation about it, no holds barred, they have this like massive fight in this scene. Ellen and Thomas finally had the courage and the honesty to really lay it all out on the table with this Nosferatu situation. Ellen reminds him of the choice that he made and how she begged him not to make that choice. She says to him, "Where's your promotion? Where's your money? I know you have brought all this evil upon us. I know it. I can feel it. And you brought it upon us for naught. You have cursed us, and all of Wisburg is in despair." And they have this back and forth, and Thomas says, "It was for us." And Ellen responds, "For what? For what? For these things?" And she starts throwing an absolute tantrum in the room. I mean, like ripping furniture from the walls and like, breaking fine china and things like that. So I tell you guys all of this because I think it makes you understand why Ellen dresses the way that she does, in that she still recognizes fineries. Her gowns are beautifully detailed, and yet they're not as fine as her friend Anna's clothes. She's not even as put together as her friend Anna. One other factor that you see in the movie is how her gowns change from colors. I think we see her for the first time in this sort of pastel green, like printed gown with like little flowers on it. And then she had a pink gown with a bonnet and then a blue one. And gradually, as her situation worsens, she ends up in black morning gowns. And then, of course, at the very end, nothing at all. In my first watch of the movie, it immediately struck me that it can be read as an allegory for three things. So first is about mental illness. That gown, so like that scene where she has a fight with Thomas, she rips open her gown, exposing like her corset underneath. And that gown that she breaks out of, there is a shot of that from the back. It sort of like is a striped gown, and the stripe sort of comes to a V. And when a gown is beautifully and, carefully made, the V's would like line up against each other. But for whatever reason, they're askew in this movie. They're not matching. They're not aligned perfectly. And I think that that's a visual signal that, one, she's not rich enough because she couldn't buy enough fabric that lined up perfectly with each other. But also, two, a sign that she's a little bit off. There's something a little bit wrong here. Something is askew. And Ellen's loneliness is really, really highlighted from the start. As a child, as I said, that's when she first meets Nosferatu. She gets better when she marries Thomas, but then that loneliness comes back to her again when Thomas leaves her for work. Coincidentally, these two moments, her childhood and after Thomas leaves, are also the moments when Nosferatu has a tighter grip on her. I mean, she explicitly says in the movie that Thomas has helped keep Nosferatu away, and I'm theorizing here, but I think Obviously, that's because Thomas gave Ellen a sense of belonging, a sense of home, of care, of love. And so when he leaves her, her situation worsens and she starts having these really violent seizures. So one of the quotes that really struck me in the film is when Ellen was talking to Anna and she says, "Do you ever feel at times as if you're not a person? What I wish to say is that you're not truly present nor alive, as if you're at the whim of another, like a dog. Someone or something had the power to breathe life into you, to move you." I remember this is 1838 Germany. There were just so many misconceptions about how to deal with mental illness. We see scenes, for example, where Ellen is tied to the bed at the advice of the family doctor. And the same doctor tells her to sleep in her corsets to stop her from sleepwalking because it sort of regulates her blood better, or whatever, Victorian superstition he held at that time. And so when you approach the film in this way, you realize that it's her running away from her own mind, and her and the people around her not being able to deal with her mental illness. The corset is quite an important part of the storytelling of this film. The kind of corset that it is a fan-laced corset, which means that it can be laced up from the front. So this is a significant detail because, of course, Ellen and Thomas do not have servants, and so they have to dress themselves. A fan-laced corset, which laces up in the front, allows you to adjust your corset the way that you want it without having another person help you. It was also this corset which was used to impose control on her by tightening it, as I mentioned earlier, and by using it to tie her to the bed. And there's a very important scene in that fight scene. Again, she rips open her dress and sort of breaks free from this bondage, as it were. And whether you understand that bondage as mental illness or, as I'll talk about next, promiscuity, I think the meaning of the garment, it still holds water. Promiscuity, let's talk about it. That is the second reading that I think you can have with this film. It's just the trials and tribulations of being a sexual woman in 1838 Germany. I mean, as we can imagine, sex at this time was very taboo and was very much seen as just a tool for women to procreate, to have kids. And indeed, as the memes have shown, Nosferatu is a very sexual film, but it portrays sex in a way that is not fun. It portrays sex as something to be repressed, something to be ashamed of. I think that Nosferatu for Ellen is an embodiment of lust. And what's heartbreaking about that is that I think that Ellen views that as a bad thing, as something to be destroyed. And that's why Nosferatu is portrayed as this awful demonic being. In one exchange that Ellen and Nosferatu has during the film, Ellen says, "I have felt you, crawling like a serpent in my body." And Count Orlok says, "It's not me, it is your own nature." Ellen responds, "No, I love Thomas," to which Count Orlok says, "Love is inferior to you. I told you, you are not of humankind." Count Orlok then says this really important line, "I am an appetite, nothing more." And so I think that when you can totally watch this film and see Count Orlok as sex demonized, as an incubus type creature almost. The third reading I took away from this film is that of an abusive relationship, and the relationship between Ellen and Nosferatu certainly bears classic hallmarks of being in an abusive relationship, from meeting Count Orlok as a young girl, to him stalking her over oceans and not listening to her pleas to leave him alone, to the effect that it has on Ellen herself. Abusive relationships are very rarely straightforward, and very often, although the person who is being abused would like to leave the abusive situation, it is still emotionally very difficult for them to do so. They've opened themselves up to this person, and that abuser can use their emotions to manipulate them. In this scenario, the abuser is very explicitly portrayed as a literal monster who has shaped this relationship with Ellen, full of fear, of manipulation, and of toxic obsession. Nosferatu takes advantage of Ellen's prayer, which I quoted earlier, and uses that to justify his possession of her. a prayer that she says when she was a young woman, which is manifested too in the nightgowns that she wears in that scene. Linda Muir has been quoted as saying that they did numerous tests for the nightgown, 3 different ways, as they figured out what would be an appropriate amount of body to show and an appropriate amount of vulnerability to show. In that nightgown, which is white, of course, the universal symbol of purity and chastity, Ellen looks pure, yes, but also frail and soft, sort of waifish. And that's the kind of person that Nosferatu chose to abuse, a frail, lonely, young woman. The result of that abuse, as we see in the film, is total chaos and destruction, from the plague that takes over the city to the effects that it has on Ellen. It is pure torture, and I think if you're viewing the film on this level of it's a relationship between Nosferatu and Ellen, there's really no other way to label it as abusive. You know, it's not dark romance, it's not forbidden love, it's abuse. Plain and simple. So those are my 3 readings of the film: mental illness, sexual promiscuity, and abusive relationship. And in my opinion, as I hope I've sort of explained to you guys, these 3 things are really well told through the language of clothing. And it's even more impressive because they had these constraints to work with, you know. The movie is set in real life, as I said, 1838 Germany, and Robert Eggers was really into making the film look as real as possible. I think that's like his philosophy as a director. He's directed a lot of these sort of like Gothic horror, like historical movies, and a lot of the time they are based in real life events. The idea being that horror lives in real life. It's not a fictional monster that we create. It is people that we interact with on a day-to-day basis. And because of that, they want the garments to be as historically accurate as possible. And from what I'm hearing from people, it achieves that pretty much. The only sort of, you know, inaccuracies within it, I think, can be justified because of the storytelling, like what message they're trying to send from the historical inaccuracy of that garment. But yeah, I would love to know if you guys watched the movie. What did you think of it, and what did you think of the clothes? Let's have a conversation in the comments below. This has been A Love Letter To. I'm your host, Danielle Olavario. Thank you so much for being with me and listening to this episode. Next week, we will be talking about Conclave, a movie which I enjoyed so much. I love that movie. It was giving sort of Real Housewives of the Vatican. It was so juicy. I was hooked from the first frame. I love that movie. So I'm really excited to talk about the costuming in it. But until then, give us a follow on our socials at A Love Letter To Podcast on everything. If you enjoyed this episode, do leave us a review also wherever you're listening. It really does help the show. And feel free to send me a love DM about what you think of this episode and what movies you want me to go through next, especially after Oscar season. Okay, that's all for me. Bye. Have a good week.